So, Ash, last week Sony approached both of us and provided us with early access to The Last of Us Part 1, the PS5 remake of the PS3 and PS4 game.
Yeah,
So we've been hands-on with this for a while, and I think now is a good time for us to finally talk about it. What do you think?
agreed. I am ready to endure and survive and talk about this game.
Yeah, a couple months ago, I think we had a discussion on when is it too soon to do a remake, and it was specifically really about this game.
Right.
So now that you've had hands on it, without going too deep, do you think it was too soon?
So I wasn't on that discussion, but I agreed with the general tenor of it, and it still feels a bit too soon, I guess. But with that said, it looks incredible too. So I'm of two minds on it, because it's like, yeah, it is too soon to remake The Last of Us again. I still feel that way, but damn if this game isn't a looker, man. This game looks absolutely stunning. So I'm definitely of two minds on it, right?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you and disagree in some respects. So on the face of it, thinking like generationally, I'm like, oh, well, this was a PS3 game that came to PS4 and is now on PS5. Like, did we need this? But at the same time, for the purpose of kind of refreshing my memory, while I was playing The Last of Us Part 1 on PS5, I actually re-downloaded The Last of Us Remastered, the PS4 game, and looked at my save, and I realized my save is 8 years old.
Oh,
And
wow.
I that it feels like it hasn't been that long.
That's
It
so
feels like it's
weird.
been maybe 5 years at most, but when you think about it, The Last of Us Remastered, which is itself a re-release, is almost a decade old. And in that sense, I think like 8 years, I'm like, that is a decent amount of time. Like that is if somebody said it to me that way rather than it's a last gen game that we're
Yeah.
porting again, then I start to think, well, 8 years, like if it was another game and someone just said, hey, this hasn't been re-released in 8 years, I would probably instinctively say, oh, well, yeah, then that's fine. Like, that's okay to re-release an 8-year-old game on a new platform. But when you say, oh, that 8 years ago, that platform was just one generation back.
Yeah,
So
God, it's so
I
weird.
agree that I'm kind of two minds on it. And then, as you know, I played The Last of Us Remastered and then went back to The Last of Us Part 1 on PS5. And like you said, the improvement is almost unbelievable. Like
Yeah.
it is a huge visual improvement. When you're playing on PS5, if you don't go back and look, your mind kind of tricks you into thinking like, oh, well, this is just marginally better.
Right.
This is just something of an improvement. But when you actually go back and you play the game, and if you go back all the way and play the PS3 version, it is mind-blowing just how much better this game looks.
It really is, particularly the character models. Like, I mean, and the character models already look great in The Last of Us Remastered, of course, but it's pretty wild when you see them side by side, just how much better this game looks. And I agree with you. Your brain plays tricks on you. You're thinking as you're playing it, oh, this can't look that much better. But then you go and look at them side by side, because I didn't re-download it, because I didn't have room. But I did watch like a big chunk of a playthrough of The Last of Us Remastered just to kind of remind myself. And if you're not looking at it side by side, it's hard to immediately see how much better this game actually looks. But then once I saw that, and as I kept playing, I'm like, this game really, really looks stunning. And it's funny, I didn't realize it had been 8 years. That's when you put it in terms like that, it's like, okay, maybe it is time for this game to be remade, maybe. But yeah, I gotta say, it's been a real treat. And this is my third time playing the game now, too. And it's been a real treat kind of rediscovering the game yet again with this. I hesitate to even call it a new coat of paint, because it really, I know it's, they use the marketing speak, rebuilt from the ground up for PS5. But you can kind of see the evidence. It really has been rebuilt from the ground up. It looks, I keep using the word stunning, and that's really what I keep coming down to. I keep like swinging the camera around and just looking at all the vistas, and I'm just like, wow, this really does stand out as one of the best looking games on PS5. And when you look at it next to The Last of Us Remastered, there's really no comparison.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel like there's a real interesting facet to this, in that, like you said, there are times where I'm playing it and I just kind of sink into the familiar feeling of playing this game. Because like you, I'm playing it for the third time. I played it on PS3, I played it on PS4, now I'm playing it on PS5, which does sound not that great when you say it that way. But, you know, there is, like you said, it would be a disservice to just call it a fresh coat of paint on this game. Like, it is completely redone. The models, the environments, they all feel, it doesn't have that familiar feeling of taking an old game and up-resing it. It feels like they actually recreated the assets for this game. And there are things that I noticed, like posters on walls. Like, every one of them is legible on the texture. Like, you don't have to actually hit the read button to read things anymore. You know, everything is very clear and crisp and detailed. Joel and Ellie, their animations are just, you know, leagues better than they were on the PlayStation 4 even. But where I noticed it the most, like you kind of implied, is in the environmental details. Yeah. That was the thing that took me out of the feeling that this is just the game I remember slightly prettier, and to where I was like, wow, this is full-on remake territory. You just see like such lush details in like the overgrown plants that are covering buildings or springing forth out of asphalt, and you're like, wow, this was something that I distinctly remember that even on the PS4 it didn't look nearly this good. And I think that that's pretty impressive, but there's a lot more to this remake beyond just the visuals, right? There's a whole host of other options, particularly in the accessibility arena, that make this kind of a more definitive edition of the game. Particularly, one of the things that I really liked was the granularity of the difficulty settings, which is something that they kind of took from The Last of Us Part 2 and brought over to this version, where you have very fine control over the difficulty. Did you play with any of those options?
I didn't personally, just because I don't personally really need to make use of them, but I did go through them, and I love, as you said, the granularity. Like, just as in The Last of Us Part 2, Naughty Dog really are, like, leading the charge when it comes to accessibility features in games, and I love to see it. If you were a fan of the accessibility features in Part 2, you're gonna love the accessibility features in Part 1. There are so many fine, tiny little ways you can fine-tune the experience to your liking, from broad strokes stuff like font size or subtitle size for both story and combat subtitles, to having a background for the subtitles so they're more easily legible, to so many different other things. And there's so many different categories of accessibility as well, which I just love to see. I mean, you and I are both huge believers in games being as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, and The Last of Us Part 1 absolutely knocks it out of the park in that respect.
Yeah, I absolutely love that you can choose, whether you want to get more ammunition or whether you want your NPC characters to be more durable so they're not dying on you, when you're trying to protect yourself, on top of other things. You can, and it goes the opposite way. If you're looking for a huge challenge, you can also make everything much more difficult, or you can make specific aspects of the game more difficult. You can reduce the amount of ammo you find, or you can make enemies take more bullets. In the interest of kind of seeing as much of the game as possible, I knocked down settings to light difficulty on a couple occasions just to kind of push through. And there's an interesting, I found an interesting argument to be made, but one thing I wanted to highlight before I jump topics completely, one of the more unique features that is brand new to The Last of Us Part 1 is that they introduced a capability with the DualSense to kind of detect the tenor of speech through vibration.
Cool.
For folks that have difficulty discerning through audio or visual cues what someone's mood or temperament is as they speak, they included like a vibration feature, which they claim, will kind of help folks that have difficulty with that discern it through touch. And I was like, that's a really cool thing to do for people. I've played with it myself, and I think it's kind of a cool feature. Like, you can tell if people are being more forceful from like the impact that the DualSense is having in your hands. And for me, a neurotypical person, it's just a cool like extra feature. But for some folks, that's going to be like a huge deal, so they kind of understand the gravity of certain cutscenes and conversations that they might otherwise not be able to grasp. I thought that was a really cool, like, brand new accessibility feature that they added for this game.
That is really, really cool. And there are also like different audio cues you can have for literally everything in this game. Like, you could have audio cues for when you approach a gap that you have to jump over, or that you have to where you have to crouch, or when you're near breakable glass. Things like so many minute, fine details that you can have audio cues for. Like, this game really goes out of its way to make it as playable as possible, no matter who you are. And I just think that's absolutely wonderful. And you touched on something there with the haptics, Steve, that I wanted to really, kind of point out in our discussion. The haptics in this game, above and beyond the accessibility aspect of it, which is fantastic, but the haptics in this game are incredible. Like, this is one of those games that I am so happy I'm playing with the DualSense, because the haptics just feel so good. And you know me, I've always been a big believer in haptics adding to the tactile feeling of a game. I really still feel that way. I love the HD rumble on Switch when it's implemented well. Going all the way back to Star Fox 64, I thought the rumble pack added an extra dimension of tactile feeling to that game. And all, fast forward to today, we have advanced haptics now, and the DualSense really does make a difference when playing this game. It adds an extra layer of interactivity to me that did not exist in The Last of Us Remaster or the original on PS3. And even something as minute as when you're in an area where it's raining, you can feel like the it's not overdone, but you can feel the pitter patter of the rain. And I love things like that.
Yeah, it was interesting because at first I was thinking, my immediate point of comparison when I think about, rain specifically was Returnal. And I was like, this isn't as strong in Returnal. And then I was thinking, but Joel's not wearing like a rubber spacesuit either.
Right.
He's wearing normal clothes, so it would make sense that it's a lot weaker in sensation. But I agree with you wholeheartedly, using the bow and arrow, which is a common thing now. I feel like that's almost a DualSense meme.
Right.
Using bow and arrow and feeling resistance. But I feel like they got it just right. Using guns also feels really satisfying with the triggers.
Be that, yeah.
But this is, and just the way you feel sensations in the environment. Like, I could feel minute vibrations when I'm like crawling around in debris, like trying to sneak up on a clicker. I could feel like the sensation of whatever was under Joel's feet. So I think they did a really, really great job with DualSense haptics implementation and the resistive triggers. It uses the features of the DualSense really well, but not so much that it feels like they were just trying to shoehorn them in.
Right. And of course, you can turn all that off. I know there are people out there who don't like the adaptive triggers. They don't necessarily like rumble, and you can turn all that off if that's not what you want. But if you do like it, this is one of the best showcases on the PS5 of what the DualSense can do.
Yeah, and it's, in general, The Last of Us Part 1 is one of the best showcase games on the PS5 now. Like, visually, it's a cut above most other things I've played. I would say the only other game that I would compare it to in terms of just how well it uses the PlayStation hardware is probably Horizon Forbidden West at this point.
Yeah.
It's a visual showcase. I would say in many cases it looks better than Forbidden West, which makes sense because, the game is kind of more restrictive in scope than an open world game like Horizon. Which obviously means smaller environments, more intimate encounters, means that you can have more detail.
Right.
But I would say that, The Last of Us manages to really capture the sense of what made the original so magical, and it makes this interesting argument. I call this like the reverse Final Fantasy VII argument, because this is a game that, if you're not aware, The Last of Us Part 1 doesn't change anything. Like, there's no changes to gameplay, no changes to story. This is just the exact game we've had for the last two generations, just far better looking and with a ton more accessibility and other types of options. Modernized in the sense that the options available to you are in line with what you'd expect from a brand new game in 2022. But the actual gameplay is completely unchanged at this point.
God, that's wild when you put it in those terms. Even when you said 8 years for The Last of Us Remastered, when you talk about 12 to 15, that's just good Lord. Where does the time go?
I know. I think of The Last of Us as a game that came out like, it's weird because I have, children, and The Last of Us Remake is almost as old as my oldest kid. And I'm thinking, I don't remember you being a baby when this came out. But, and I certainly don't think of the fact that I didn't even have kids when the PlayStation 3 was on store shelves. So it's really interesting to see just how it's a lot longer ago than we think. But I have to say, I played up to Pittsburgh. I played up to the point where you get kind of stuck in the water in that museum or the hotel in Pittsburgh. And it was just, I still remember that being deeply frustrating. And it's still deeply frustrating, by the way, to try to navigate that part of the game. But the AI does seem somewhat improved. I will say that enemies do seem a little bit smarter than they were, but not by such a wide margin that I feel like I'm suddenly having to change tactics to successfully complete encounters. Did you notice anything change, like in enemy behavior or anything like that while you played?
Not particularly, and just to keep us honest, because I know we'll get called out for this in the comments, the original Last of Us came out in 2013, so it is actually 9 years old, and then Last of Us Remastered came out in 2014, just a year later, so that's 8 years old. That
is weird. So, I mean, when you put it in those terms,
I know.
It's a lot less egregious for the remake to come out when there was 1 year between The Last of Us, because back at the time that The Last of Us Remastered came out, I wasn't getting early access to video games, so I didn't have a review code for that. I didn't cover it in that way. I just bought it off store shelves like a regular person. So I mean, 8 years is 1 year between. I would question that, but 8 years in between feels like it's just I would say that's like an appropriate amount of time.
I think so too, actually. That which is so weird, because I was definitely on the it's way too soon to remake The Last of Us train, and part of me still feels that way, but when I really look at the dates and look and see that there's only a year apart between The Last of Us and Remastered, and then 8 years since Remastered, okay, I mean, that's a pretty good chunk of time. So I feel, I guess, a little bit differently about it, but to go back to your original question, no, the enemy AI doesn't feel that different, and I think maybe that's like my only sticking point with this game, not the AI specifically, because it's still good, but this does feel a little dated in terms of the way it plays. Like, if you play this next to The Last of Us Part 2 obviously feels like a more mechanically evolved game, and I think that's really my only potential sticking point. Like, if you wanted to play The Last of Us today, I would say wholeheartedly play The Last of Us Part 1. It is the definitive version of the game. Absolutely, no questions asked. If you have a PS5 and you want to play The Last of Us 1, play Part 1. That's how you should play it. But if you're not feeling like, if you're feeling like it hasn't been long enough, or you're feeling like you just, you haven't been, I don't know, if you're not feeling like you really need to play The Last of Us again, this isn't going to convince you, because it is very much, as you said, Steve, the exact same game, just it with tons more accessibility features and absolutely stunning current generation visuals. But the game itself does feel pretty much the exact same, and there aren't really, again, we've only played it 3 times each, right? But it doesn't feel meaningfully different to me, and it sounds like it doesn't to you either.
Yeah, I would say the new visuals are definitely a treat for the eyes, and to me, The Last of Us, it's a great story. I love the story of that game. There are deeply emotional, gut-wrenching moments in this game that hit even harder now that the visuals are so improved.
Oh yeah.
I mentioned to you about playing the opening moments of this game when we both got our codes, and I was crying. I was crying like instantly, in those opening moments. If you know, we're not going to spoil it here, but and there are other moments in the game that are heartwarming and beautiful and absolutely worth revisiting with a new, with a fresh coat of paint to kind of oversimplify things. But I think that The Last of Us Part 1, like you said, it's not going to bring someone who wrote off the original releases to the table unless they just want to witness the visuals. If you're really into graphics and you want something that shows off the PS5 in the best possible light, The Last of Us Part 1 is a great game for that. Or if, like me, you played through it and you loved the story, and after apparently 8 years, you're ready to revisit it, then this is a great way to revisit it. And I do anticipate that I'll be playing it beyond beyond the making of this video. I want to finish the rest of the story just for the sake of seeing, how they've reimagined other parts of the world.
Same.
And I also want to play Left Behind. I actually skipped that DLC, and that's included in this release as well. Did you ever play Left Behind?
No, I didn't, actually. I meant to play it when I played The Last of Us Remastered, and I just got pulled away by other stuff, so I never really came back to it, and this is the time. I'm going to play it properly now as part of The Last of Us Part 1.
Yeah, exactly. I plan to do that too. The multiplayer mode, unfortunately, was stripped out of this. So if you've played The Last of Us on PS3 or PS4, there was a multiplayer mode in that. I'll be honest, I played maybe one match of the multiplayer mode back in the day, and I thought it sucked.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it didn't pull me in. What sounds like you might have a different opinion.
No, I didn't even bother. You know me, I'm not a big multiplayer guy unless it's like Smash.
Fair.
At least online multiplayer guy. I'm more of a couch multiplayer. So I didn't bother. I may have played a match or two if I maybe, and I felt the same way. It wasn't something that I felt the need to come back to. But that's if I even did play a match. If I did, it wasn't memorable to me because I don't remember it. But there's no multiplayer mode here for those of you who may care about that.
Yeah, and I feel like I know some people will say like, oh, it's not definitive if it doesn't have all the modes, but I also feel like there is probably I think that we all know by now that developers collect a lot of data from the games that they release. Yeah. And I have to imagine that there was some point at which they looked at the player base for the multiplayer mode and just probably said, you know what, it's probably not worth it for us to recreate this. Like, there's not enough people that had interest in it, even historically, to want this. I don't know what the reason is, but I can say personally, as someone who loved the game, multiplayer didn't interest me in the slightest because it doesn't fit with the vibe of the single player content.
Yeah.
The world of The Last of Us isn't one where I can imagine random people picking up guns and engaging in arena-based warfare. And I get that there's lots of human-on-human encounters, and I know someone in the comments is going to be like, okay, but
sure.
it's something that didn't fit the vibe of the game. I've always seen The Last of Us as like a great single-player experience, something that tells
Definitely.
like a really moving story. That's kind of the thing that pulls me along the game, is wanting to experience the world and the story. And multiplayer just doesn't jibe with that idea at all, in my opinion.
Completely agree. The Last of Us is something that I primarily come to for the characters and the story, not necessarily the gameplay. While the gameplay is great and I enjoy it, I'm really there for the super interesting characters, the subtle multi-layered narrative. That's just kind of what I come to The Last of Us for. I feel like the vibe of the multiplayer is something that's maybe a little bit more appropriate for something like Uncharted. As I completely agree. Part of The Last of Us is just really taking in the world and taking in the gravity of what's happened to the world and what's happened to society. And there's a lot of quiet. There's a lot of quietude in The Last of Us. I think the loud parts of the game stand out all the more because so much of the game is defined by how quiet everything is. Society has completely fallen apart. You're in the middle of a giant city like Pittsburgh and it's quiet because society's gone. And so I think The Last of Us is something that's kind of defined by that quietude and that very specific sad, somber mood. And the multiplayer just kind of flew right in the face of that.
Absolutely.
I completely agree.
So, we don't have a ton to say. This is a game that came out, 9 years ago, and that we've played 3 times. And I feel like if you haven't picked up The Last of Us on the previous 2 generations of consoles, then you're probably... You've either... Well, I should say, if you're a gamer who had access to a PS3 or PS4 and chose not to pick up The Last of Us, then there's probably not a ton here to convince you to pick it up on PS5. Though, I would say... For me, this is like the gaming equivalent of required reading. If you have access to it, you should at least try The Last of Us. And I agree that the PS5 version, for my money, is the best way to experience it, especially in 2022. If you have a PS5 and you have interest in The Last of Us, I would recommend picking this up over either of the previous versions. It's just so much better looking, and if you have like a modern display, if you have, a TV that can support all of the PS5's fancy features like VRR or variable refresh rate, then this will smooth out the experience.
Yeah.
On the technical end, and I don't think we've talked about this a lot, there's options for various video performance modes. I played it in fidelity mode, because VRR on a compatible TV really makes it feel very smooth. But if you don't have one of those, you will notice significant frame drops down into like the 20s here and there while playing the game. Even with VRR on, I noticed that there were times where the game started to slow down or chug a little bit, when I would sweep the camera around from time to time. But if you play on the lower modes, like the performance modes, that eliminates the problem altogether. But of course, the game isn't as pretty. It's still way better than on PS4. But for a game like The Last of Us, where the combat is not really twitchy or intensive, because you do a lot of stealth, like you're encouraged to sneak, then I was fine with the frame rate kind of being a little unstable. What about you?
So I've switched back and forth, but I have played most of the game on the fidelity mode. And what I love about fidelity mode in this is it does the same thing that Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart did. It introduced a 40 FPS mode, essentially, later in a post-release patch. And this game launches with it. And that 40 FPS mode, it looks so good. Like you said, Steve, it's just smooth enough. And I'm not one of those, 30 FPS is never enough people. I'm okay with 30 FPS in certain games, for sure. It depends on the genre, it depends on the game. I'm not an anti-30 FPS guy. But typically, I will prefer performance, like 60 FPS over, higher fidelity. And this 40 FPS mode hits that sweet spot perfectly. It looks stunning in terms of the actual fidelity. You're getting 4K, but you're getting just a little bit more than 30 FPS, and it's just smooth enough that it looks absolutely incredible. And I have knocked it to performance mode a few times just for comparison purposes. And it looks great in performance mode too. It is a buttery smooth 60 FPS. I believe it's 1440p 60 FPS if I remember correctly, and it looks amazing. But if you do want that extra bit of fidelity, you knock it to fidelity mode and you get this really smooth 40 FPS performance. But as you said, there are frame drops in fidelity mode, and I noticed it most either when swinging around the camera, as you said, or when I got too close to something with a lot of particle effects, like the flaming oil drums, for example. If you get too close to that, the performance stutters a little bit. It's nothing anywhere close to game ruining or anything like that, but you will notice frame drops if you're playing on fidelity mode here and there. If you're playing on performance mode, I at least personally have not seen a single instance of stuttering or anything like that in performance mode. So just know that going in, you are going to hit some frame drops if you play in fidelity mode, but they are very much
I agree with that. Like you said, our experiences sound very similar. Particularly if you went into a room with a lot of spores in the air and you would try to move the camera around a lot, you would definitely notice that the PS5 sometimes had a little bit of trouble with maintaining a solid frame rate. But like you said, those dips are very infrequent, and they don't occur with such magnitude that your game breaks as a result. And typically you don't see that like in a combat encounter or anything like that. But yeah, if you are having issues, there is the performance mode. There's a ton of different options. These games are becoming more and more like PC games, it feels like, with the amount of video options we get.
Seriously.
But yeah, it seems like Sony's studios are seeming to share information, because we got that same stuff in Spider-Man and Miles Morales as well now, after Ratchet and Clank got them. So it feels like developers, at least internally at Sony, are starting to figure out how to squeeze the best possible frame rates and performance out of the PS5 now that it's a couple years old, which itself is crazy to say. We're coming up on 2 years of the PS5.
It really is.
But yeah, I would say that's probably all we've got for The Last of Us. I think it's a great game. I think if you've never played it, you absolutely should pick it up on PS5. But if you did pick it up on PS4 or PS3 and you didn't love it, you're probably not going to love it here either. There's just not enough in terms of gameplay mechanical changes. But if you're all about seeing the best graphics on your console, currently The Last of Us, for my money, is the winner in that department. It's the best looking game I've seen on the console, and I'm sure it'll be dethroned by the next internal developed PlayStation game. This strikes me though as like I would say that this was probably Naughty Dog's project to get really accustomed to the PS5 hardware. I'm sure we've seen this time and again where developers take one of their old games and revamp it to try to get familiar with the tools on the PS5, and then that ends up becoming a retail release rather than just a demo they stick on a shelf. What do we think we're going to see next from Naughty Dog? Do we think there's going to be a Last of Us 3, or are they going to move on to something else now?
Man, I would like to see them move on to something else, but it does kind of feel like they become the Last of Us studio, and I can't say I would be surprised if we ended up getting The Last of Us Part 3 next, which I'd be okay with. I'm not against that necessarily, but I would kind of like to see them do something else. What that something else necessarily is, I can't say, but a new original
I feel
project
like
from them
Neil
might be really
Druckmann
exciting.
mentioned a while back that they were working on a new IP. I could be wrong about that, but I think he said that.
I believe.
But I mean, they have
he
the Last
did,
of Us show coming
yeah.
out soon, so I feel like it would be weird if there wasn't some kind of video game tie-in to that. Maybe this is the tie-in, right? Maybe The Last of Us Part 1 is how you get people that are going to watch the show to come play the game, which isn't necessarily a bad idea. But let's go ahead and close this out. If we were doing a traditional review, Ash, what rating do you think you would give The Last of Us Part 1?
Oh man, I'd probably give it great vibes. As we kind of touched on, you and I seem to mostly pretty much completely agree on this. It is an absolute stunner in terms of its looks. It is a showpiece for the console. You're not going to really find any other better looking games in the PS5. Maybe we could say Horizon Forbidden West probably looks as good as, but really, for my money, as you said, The Last of Us Part 1 is the best looking game on the console. It really is incredible. And to be fair, you and I are both playing on the same TV, and we're very lucky. We're both playing on really nice OLED TVs, 4K. We got all the bells and whistles. But it's a showpiece for the console. But the gameplay hasn't really been changed in any meaningful way. So if you've already played The Last of Us and you're not ready to go back to it, I don't think this is going to change your mind. And if, as you said, Steve, if you played it already and it wasn't your thing, this again isn't going to change your mind. So for me, it's great vibes. I would have liked to see the gameplay tweaked a little bit more personally, just to bring it a little bit more in line with Part 2, because that game does feel so much more evolved mechanically. But be that as it may, still, The Last of Us was already a great game to play to begin with. It's still a great game now, and it looks better than ever. So this is a great vibes for me.
So I would say The Last of Us Part 1 is a great vibes for me as well. I agree with a lot of what you said, Ash. I think that the game, like you said, won't win over any new fans from a mechanical perspective, but I do think it has the potential with its dramatically improved visuals to bring some new people to the table who might have written it off previously, people who are looking for the next big great game for PS5. I would argue that The Last of Us Part 1 is that game. Initially I thought that it was too soon for a remake, but after having seen both the dramatic visual improvement and realizing that it's been 8 whole years since we got it, I would say the time was actually right, even if the optics are a little bit weird on it. It's a great game that's been remade in its best possible form for Sony's latest console. I'm happy to see it back. I'm glad to be playing through it again. I'm reliving some very fond memories of the game, but I agree that the fact that the nearly 10-year-old game design definitely shows, because The Last of Us Part 2 mechanically was a big step forward for the franchise. So we're seeing the roots of that come back again.
Right. And
it reminds you that game design was in a very different place 9 years ago. So I would give it a great vibes. If it had all of the improvements mechanically that The Last of Us Part 2 did, I could see this being the perfect game. So yeah, like a pure bliss.
Like a pure bliss. And you know what is funny about that is one thing this has brought into focus for me is, even though Part 2 is mechanically superior, way more evolved, and that is absolutely true, replaying this through Part 1 has kind of brought into clear focus for me that I still do think, as much as I love Part 2, great game, really liked it, I think Part 1 is much better paced. I think the pacing throughout Part 1 is just tighter, and I'm having more fun throughout.
I agree with that. I think Part 2's kind of, for not going into spoiler territory, but Part 2's kind of major 2-act structure definitely harmed the game's pacing.
Yeah.
I think it told a great narrative, and it was an engaging play and an amazing story throughout. But I agree that Part 1 is much more tightly paced and keeps the player far more engaged throughout. So I would agree with that. And I think that there are definitely ways in which Part 1 is a better game than Part 2. And I know the internet at large agrees with that. But I would still say both are great games. They make together, they tell an incredibly compelling story. I'd love to see a Part 3, but for now, if you've never played Part 1, pick it up. You probably won't be sorry. Yeah, I definitely recommend it. I think
Yeah.
this is great. Thanks again to Sony for sending us codes for this so that we could check it out early. And Ash, since you're our Patreon guru, do you want to tell folks where they can find us if they're interested in supporting us beyond watching this video?
Sure, yeah. Of course, please do like and subscribe. That always helps us here on YouTube. But if you want to find out how you can support us on Patreon, we do offer a lot of really cool perks to all of our patrons. So head on over to patreon.com/gbgaming. You can support us for just starting at just $1 a month. That gets you into our Discord community, which is the best damn gaming community on the internet. We still got to trademark that line because it is so true. We just have the most incredible community. But you can also join our live audience where you can chat with our community live, react with us as we do GVG cast, do reaction streams. You can even play games with one of us founders once a month if you'd like at the Fight a Founder tier. It's a lot of fun. But yeah, so head on over to patreon.com/gbgaming. But if you can't support us on Patreon, just liking, subscribing here on YouTube makes all right.
With that said, stay tuned to GVG. We are actually, at the time that this goes live, we are on our way to PAX West 2022. We'll be having a ton of coverage right here on the channel of probably a few live events as well. So stay tuned for more information on that. Thank you guys so much for watching. Check out The Last of Us Part 1 if you're so inclined, and we will see you next time.